is online, then we'll be bringing them onto the stream as well so that they can tell us more about their podcast. They can join us and answer some questions and some things, because we want to recognize the internationality of their podcast, recognize the change that they're making with the podcast and more. But before we do that, I want to help you learn some things about podcasting and podcasts. And you might hear this, you haven't heard it so much here, but you might hear podcasters often talk about the importance of their ranking, their ratings and reviews and such. And there are a few things that as podcasters we get wrong with certain things, or I don't know where the information quite starts, but we often hear something and we simply repeat it. One of those big things is that we ask for ratings and reviews for the podcast, thinking that helps us climb the charts inside of iTunes. I did an episode of the Audacity podcast about the what good are ratings and reviews. I want to share with you some of those thoughts, because this is the thing that we think, this is the currency. Now, ratings and reviews are great to get, and if you can get them from your audience, they can do incredible things for you. But I'll tell you right away, podcast rankings are not based on your ratings and reviews. Now, your opportunity to show up in the mythical unicorn magic of iTunes New and Noteworthy might be affected somewhat from your iTunes ratings and reviews, but it's not your actual rank. Now, I see Paul Colligan is here in the chat. So Paul, if you want to jump in on this conversation, because Paul has some actual experience with this and some actual data on this that he has worked with some of his clients. So Paul, just click on that camera icon, and it doesn't matter if your audio is perfect or your camera is perfect. We'll try and get you on here to share some of your insights as well. When you go into iTunes, you'll see podcasts have a couple hundreds, dozens, maybe thousands of ratings and reviews. And what you might not realize is that does not reflect the ranking or the popularity of the podcast. People will talk about the mythical unicorn magic of iTunes New and Noteworthy and how they're number one in iTunes. Well, it's not. iTunes New and Noteworthy is actually not a ranking system. There is no number one. In fact, consistently, whatever we put or would call the number one position isn't actually a true number one. There are no numbers in there. And that top left position doesn't really reflect any special importance of that podcast over any of the others. It's simply, that's where Apple put you. Most of the New and Noteworthy categories are based on Apple's own editorial selection, not pure algorithm. Now, there might be things you can do to make you appear more to Apple. The biggest two things you can do to catch Apple's attention and be featured in New and Noteworthy are, this is really tough, so you might want to get pen and pencil. Number one, be new. Or number two, be noteworthy. That's what it takes to get in iTunes New and Noteworthy, and you can be noteworthy at any time. The actual effect from being new and noteworthy might not be as much as you think it would be. Now, I really want to get Paul in here, but he's having a couple issues. Paul, there should be some kind of call-in button or join on the iOS app. Not quite sure. I can't remember what it is in the app, but there is a way to join. So if you can, I'll see that request and I'll try and get you in here. So let's talk about what reviews can do for you. And we'll talk more about actual data of what does help you rank better in other ways. But what reviews can do for you, they're not completely meaningless. They can do some cool things. Remember, they can't affect your ranking. I'm going to struggle with my R words a lot in this. So if you just hear me say ratings and reviews, it's going to be a long day. You'll see me in the closing live stream as well at 2 a.m. my time. Ratings and reviews, I think primarily are social proof for your podcast. It shows a number of how many people like this podcast enough to say something about it? Yeah, it also kind of shows how many people dislike this podcast enough to say something about it. But those ratings and reviews can help someone decide on consuming your podcast over your competitor. But it does take a couple more steps for them. Let me explain. When you go into iTunes and you find a podcast, you're browsing a category, you do a search, anything like that, you'll see the podcast cover art, the title of the podcast, the author of that podcast. You don't see the number of ratings and reviews until you click on the podcast name. So someone has to already have decided to click on that podcast before they see how many ratings and reviews that podcast has. So the ratings and reviews are one aspect of convincing someone to choose your podcast over another. But if they've already clicked on your podcast, there's something more important than your ratings and reviews that got there, like the relevance of your title, your cover art, the attractiveness of your cover art design that got them to click. Now what can convince them to click subscribe is how relevant does your content seem? How consistent is your content? How quality is your content? And a small factor that might help them decide that is the number of ratings and reviews. I know when we're doing product shopping, we often look at reviews and the number of ratings and such. But when you are looking at podcasts, you might not do that same thing, because typically we're not simply browsing or finding, I want a podcast about subject X. So I'm going to search subject X. I'm going to cross-compare all of these podcasts. I'm going to see which one is rated more highly than the other. People don't necessarily do that. But when you have a lot of ratings and reviews, it is a kind of social proof. Social proof, I know I've used this term a lot, is a psychological principle that basically people tend to do what other people are doing. If you go to a street corner and you see two burger restaurants, they're both open, they're both fully employed, they both started their business at the same time, but you see one burger restaurant is completely packed. In fact, there's a line going out the door to get into that burger restaurant and get burgers from that restaurant. And then you look at the other restaurant and there are only a couple people inside. Which restaurant are you more likely to go to between those two? Or which one are you more likely to want to go to? Even if you decide, the line's too long, you might decide not to go to the other one because you're thinking something like, what does everyone know about that one place that they also know about the other place? Or what's lacking here? Why is everyone over at that place? There must be something really good about that place. Maybe they're giving out free burgers. Maybe everyone knows that the burgers are much better over there than at that other place. Your podcast review can be that kind of thing. Your podcast reviews as social proof can also be a sort of bragging right to, maybe you're trying to get guests on, or you're trying to get press passes for your podcast or get some notoriety or something. And you can say things like, we're the top rated podcast, or the most positively reviewed podcast, or we have 200 5-star reviews, or anything like that. That kind of social proof can help you get a larger audience by demonstrating the connection that you have with the podcast. You can demonstrate then the influence that you have, and it is a number that's public that people can see. Podcast ratings and reviews are also a form of a testimonial. This is another value that podcast reviews are good for. It's a way of collecting testimonials for your podcast. You can look at that raw number of, 200 reviews, great. But you can also read the content of those reviews. And when you read those reviews, you can see powerful testimonials about the positive change that you're affecting on others. You can discover what kind of things are standing out to your audience as what they love or what they don't like. And other people can see what you are giving to your audience. You could even use those ratings and reviews, or the reviews rather, as testimonials for your teaching style. Maybe you're launching a product and you can say, here are reviews from my podcast listeners where I give away free content. And if this is what they say about my free content, imagine what they'd say about my paid content. when someone goes into iTunes to take the time to review a podcast, and right now, due to a couple of bugs, it's even a little bit more cumbersome to get a review posted in iTunes. But when someone does that, that says that they respect your podcast and they wanted to take the time to share. So you should even be grateful for those negative 1-star reviews. And I'll share some statistics with you later about the spread of those reviews and how likely someone is to leave a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, or 5-star review for you. But I'll share that a little bit later on. Think of it this way. People relate with people, not with a ranking or a number. So a testimonial is one person telling another person why they should subscribe to your podcast. And when you have reviews for your podcast, you have those collections of testimonials. I'll give you some tips for getting more reviews in a little bit as well. Another good thing that podcast reviews can do for you is that they allow other people to praise you. One of the things that I do in my own podcast is read some of these reviews inside of my podcast, and it's like reading testimonials. And it is, now this makes me start to feel guilty about reading them when I say this, but it is a way to quote a Bible verse here to you, to let another man praise me and not my own words. It's a way to show someone else's gratefulness instead of my saying, hey guys, I am so great. I mean, think of this. What if I said in my podcast, I share my vast knowledge of podcasting freely because I truly want you to succeed. You will be impressed with everything I offer. Now, that feels slimy to me to say that. But what if someone said something similar about me and I'm merely reading their review? In fact, this is a review that I received for one of my podcasts. Mark Descotes said, Daniel is a down-to-earth, real guy with a love for helping people. He shares his vast knowledge of podcasting freely because he truly wants other podcasters to succeed. I was so impressed with everything that he offers that I joined his podcaster society, and I couldn't be happier with the decision. So now see, someone else said it. I didn't say it. I was simply reading someone else's words. It's a way that others can praise me, and I can collect these reviews thanks to mypodcastreviews.com from all of the iTunes countries. I can filter them down to see only my 4- and 5-star reviews. And you know what's great for that is when you're struggling with your podcast, when you feel like giving up, when you feel like, this is too much work, or you get a negative review, go back to those positive reviews, those praises from your audience, and you can see, wow, they do love me. Or you can see that you have made much more of a positive effect. Yes, you'll get a negative review. And you know what? When you get a negative review, be thankful for it, because that means you're doing something good probably. Now, if you have all negative reviews, there might be something wrong. But as I'll share with you a little bit more with some actual numbers, most people are going to have mostly positive reviews. Zach said in the chat, yes, we share new reviews on our podcast whenever we get them. David said, I read emails from listeners and they are often full of praise. And he also said, I feel like Sally Field. They love me. Yep. So your ratings and reviews can help you to share the praise in a way to kind of tell how great you are without having to tell how great you are. The other thing that podcast reviews can do for you is they can engage your audience. See, it does take a lot of work to write a rating or a review, but when you can get someone to take that step, it costs them nothing, they will be more engaged. They'll be more likely to do other things, take action when you ask them to on other things. It's one step to getting them more engaged. And when they get more engaged, they'll feel more loyal to your podcast. It's like when I publicly say, oh, I love this particular thing, I'm instantly making myself a little bit more loyal to that thing because I've put my name out there to say, I really like this thing. And when you read these ratings and reviews on your podcast, it helps encourage and validate your audience, especially if you use a tool like mypodcastreviews.com to read your global reviews. There might be someone in Uganda who reviews your podcast, and they think they are the absolute only listener to your podcast in Uganda. And they think, he's never going to know I even exist. And they could be the one and only listener to your podcast from Uganda. But if they write a review for you, then you can put a name to that person, or maybe a screen name, and you can say, thank you, Joe from Uganda. Because in mypodcastreviews.com, you get to see all of your global podcast reviews and see what countries they're coming from. You can say, thank you, Joe, for that kind review. Really appreciate it. Now you've turned Joe into a celebrity, and he might go out and tell other people, you got to check this out. I was mentioned in this podcast. I'm famous. Look at this. I'm the only one from Uganda, and he recognized me. He knows me. He loves me. He really does. You're turning your audience into a more engaged, active community, and you are engaging them by reading their reviews and recognizing those people, especially in the other countries. Your ratings and reviews can also highlight your strengths. Obviously, people will point out, oh, I love it when they do this. I love this portion of the show. I love that thing that they do. And what's really encouraging about ratings and reviews that we've seen with My Podcast Reviews, which is now tracking over 1,500 podcasters with over 1,700 podcasts and a total of over 108,000 reviews that we've tracked. Of all of those reviews that have been tracked by the system, there are some really encouraging statistics that we've been able to pull from that. Like, a lot of people think, oh, if I put my podcast out there, I'm going to get some negative reviews. People aren't going to like me. They're not going to like my voice. I don't like my voice. People think things like that. And you don't have to worry so much. Let me just share with you these statistics. 92.8%. That's how many 5-star reviews there are for all of the users of My Podcast Reviews. That's nearly 101,000 5-star reviews. People who absolutely love the podcast. 92.8%. Now, these numbers have been rounded a little bit, so they may not totally add up to 100%. 4-star reviews, 3.7%. So look at 4 and 5-star reviews as positive reviews, people who love your podcast. That is over 96%. So people are 96% likely to love what you do. And the reviews that you get, the feedback you get, 90% likely to be positive. Now, in neutral territory, 3-star review, 1.2% of all of the reviews we have are 3-star review. 1-star reviews, those hated reviews, 1.4%. Now, interestingly, the least popular review, star rating that someone will leave with a review is a 2-star review at 0.9%. And that kind of makes sense, because we either really like something or absolutely love something, or we totally hate it. There aren't that many people kind of in that middle range. And the I really, really don't like it range, the 2-star range, people are, I hate it. But even that hate it and really, really don't like it kind of range, 1.4% plus 0.9%, that's 2.3%. So think of it this way. Let's put this to actual numbers. Imagine you're in a room with 100 people and you are sharing your soul with these 100 people. You are sharing your passions. You're engaging with them. You're connecting on a deep emotional level, or helping them or entertaining them, whatever your podcast is. You're bringing conversations in front of them with interviews or whatever. You're doing that for 100 people. Of those 100 people, 92 of them, almost 93 of them, love what you're doing. How many people hate what you did? 2. 2 people out of that room of 100. 2. Just think about that. Only 2 people hate that. See, very rarely do people, actually, I would say almost never do people accidentally get a podcast, or they're certainly not forced to listen to a podcast. Podcast consumption is a thing of choice. And to see that so many people will love what you are doing should encourage you to keep going. And if you don't have reviews yet, it can be very easy to get those reviews. But even if they're not public reviews, like I've said several times, your reviews really don't matter that much to your ranking. So if people simply send you feedback, take that as this is a positive review. Just assume if it's positive feedback, give it 5 stars in your mind so that it can be encouraging to you. Another thing that ratings and reviews are good for is, yes, they reveal your weaknesses. That very small percentage of negative reviews, 1.4% 1-star reviews, read those, learn from them. You don't have to read those on your podcast. And if you get one of those hateful reviews, maybe you shouldn't even read it on your podcast. It depends on what it says about you. And what does it say about you to read the negative review? Now, a way that you can use a negative review to your benefit is to acknowledge it, thank the person for their honesty. Yes, it can be painful, some of those reviews. They may cause you to cry even. They may cause you to want to give up your podcast. But someone did take the time. Your podcast meant enough to them that they took the time to write something about it. They may be gone, so you may not even have to worry about changing your podcast for them because they're already gone. But what you can say is, thank you, Matthew, for your honest review in iTunes. It was a negative review, but you took the time to share with us what you didn't like. You took the time to go into iTunes and leave that review, a very honest review. And for that, we are very grateful. Thank you. Now, what that does to you helps you be grateful for those things. What does that do for your audience? It shows your audience your maturity. It shows your audience that you care and that you are grateful and that you can learn from your mistakes and learn how to improve what you do. So these are some ways that podcast ratings and reviews are good for your podcast. They're social proof. They're public testimonials. They allow other people to praise you. They help engage your audience. They highlight your strengths and reveal your weaknesses. So what if you don't have any ratings and reviews? How can you get some more ratings and reviews? Well, if you go to mypodcastreviews.com and click on the link at the top that says get more reviews, I give you an email tutorial series on how to get more reviews. But I want to give you some of the ideas there and some of the core concepts of how to get more reviews. First of all, make it easy for your audience. Don't tell your audience, search for you in iTunes or anything like that, because then you're trying to rely on your own search engine optimization, which may not be good, and you're asking them to do some complicated things. What I recommend is make an easy link that opens directly in iTunes. And you can make that with the link maker tool, which is linkmaker.itunes.apple.com, or I'll put my link in the chat right here that you can use that to make links. These links will open automatically in iTunes. If you already have your iTunes URL, if it already has a question mark at the end, most likely it does, like question mark MT equals 2, add to that LS equals 1. LS stands for Launch Store. So that will launch directly to your podcast in iTunes on the desktop or to your podcast in the podcast app on iOS devices. So you can make then a friendly link like /iTunes or /review and tell your audience, visit myawesomepodcast.com/review to write a review for us if you enjoy the podcast. Don't ask for 5-star reviews. That's kind of tempting people to not leave a 5-star review for you. Ask for honest reviews. Or you can set it up to say, if you enjoy the podcast, please write a review for us in iTunes over at, and then you give them that friendly link. Or you can make it even easier by you put a link on your site to your podcast in iTunes and you tell them to go to your site. So you just say, go to myawesomepodcast.com and click on the iTunes button to write a review for us. Make it as easy as possible for them. Now, there are certain bugs right now inside of the iTunes system that if they're not already logged in when they write their review, some weird things happen. That will get fixed at some point, I'm sure. Other ways that you can increase your reviews is to thank people who have written reviews for you. Thank them by name and maybe even read excerpts of their reviews. This can be powerful because if I say, thank you, Clay, for your podcast review, I really appreciate it. Now, if you're Clay, what happens? Well, you feel like a superstar. If you're someone else other than Clay, one of the thoughts that might be going through your mind is, I want to get mentioned on the podcast. I want my witty review read. I want him to read my name. I want him to mention me. Or what I'm doing now with my podcast, since it's a podcast about podcasting for podcasters, about how to podcast better. It's super meta like that. What I've started doing is, if at all possible, I try to mention their podcast, mention their website address. So they're getting a mention for their podcast, which that is a great opportunity for them. But I've also started going and playing excerpts from their podcast so people can hear a little bit of their podcast. So the other podcasters out there are thinking, I'd love to get a portion of my podcast played in his podcast. I'd love to get that promotion, that shout out. That's a powerful way, that sense of belonging that then goes to those people who write the reviews. And if you have no reviews at all, well, let me back up. If you want to see all of your reviews, mypodcastreviews.com, that's the tool I created that gathers all of your reviews from all 155 iTunes stores. This would take you a long time to do this yourself. I timed myself doing it and going as quickly as I could. It took me 25 minutes to check all 155 stores. I think I might have missed a couple stores, and it was a pain to retype my name for the podcast in all 155 stores. That's 25 minutes of your life that you could spend doing something better. Use mypodcastreviews.com, sends you your reviews automatically, depending, the frequency depends on your plan. But so that can send you your reviews. Now, what if you have no reviews whatsoever? How can you get some reviews? Keep in mind, reviews do not help your ranking, so please don't ask your audience, please review the podcast because it helps us climb the iTunes charts or anything like that. Instead, give them a better incentive. Please write a review for the podcast, and we'd love to read an excerpt here on the podcast, or we'd love to give you a shout out, or everyone who reviews our podcast will be entered in this drawing. Omar Zenhom, who hosts the $100 MBA podcast, does that inside of his podcast, where every weekend he gives away a lifetime membership to his community, for his community, to someone who has written a review for him in iTunes. So he's gotten a whole bunch of reviews from that because he's offering to give away something for free. And the only thing people have to do is write a review for him in iTunes. And it's a great way to encourage those first reviews. Another thing is, if you have any positive feedback, regardless of where you are in the process of your podcast, when you receive that podcast feedback, positive podcast feedback, respond to the person, thank them for their feedback, and you could add something to it like, you know what, this would make an awesome review for our podcast. Would you mind copying and pasting that into an iTunes review? Here's the link. You give them that link that opens directly to your podcast in iTunes, and it makes it really easy. And you could tell them, just copy and paste your review in there. It'd be a great review. Love to see it there. And that can be a way to easily get those reviews because they've already said something nice to you directly. And for you to ask them to just copy that to somewhere else, super easy. Everyone I've done this with has said, yes, totally, I will go and do that. Now, many of them have actually rewritten their review because they had other things they wanted to say and add to their praise and the positive feedback. So these are big ways that you can get more podcast reviews. I've got more over on the website at mypodcastreviews.com. Click on that Get More Reviews link there to learn how you can get more podcast reviews. These kinds of things can encourage you. They can be fun. They can be exciting. And there are all kinds of fun things you can do with them. They don't help you in your rankings in iTunes. So what does help you in your iTunes rankings? It depends. What are you considering ranking? Remember, iTunes New and Noteworthy is not a ranking system. So don't think about your appearing there in a certain number or anything like that. There is no number. All you have to do is be new or noteworthy, and you can be noteworthy at any point in there. And even being in iTunes New and Noteworthy, Paul Colligan wasn't able to join us, so I'll share some of the information he's found. He has seen his podcasts, some of his clients' podcasts, being new and noteworthy and get nothing. But he's seen some of his clients' podcasts rise to #1 in certain categories with no reviews whatsoever, or very few reviews. Rob Walsh from Libsyn has also seen this and done multiple tests to discover it's really about subscriptions. That's what helps you climb the rankings. And many podcasters are seeing that being in new and noteworthy isn't really all it's cracked up to be. It is not the thing that will make or break the success of your podcast. It's simply acknowledging something that you're already doing. See new and noteworthy as a reward, or being featured anywhere as a reward for success that you already have. It's not the cause of your podcast success. Now, what can new and noteworthy do for you does depend on other factors as well. If you are a nobody with a podcast that's extremely niche, being in iTunes new and noteworthy probably won't help you that much, because it's niche and there's nothing wrong whatsoever with being a niche podcaster. Or for our United Kingdom viewers and other non-American viewers, niche podcaster. And there's nothing wrong with being a nobody. It's fine being a nobody. I quote nobody who has influence over a global audience. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with having a small show. Nothing wrong with not monetizing your podcast. Who benefits from new and noteworthy, though, that I've seen who do get the massive downloads are those people who already have a massive platform, who already have some kind of brand recognition. For example, when Shaquille O'Neal launched his podcast, showed up in new and noteworthy, of course, and people would see that and think, oh, Shaq has a podcast. Awesome. I'm going to check it out. Now, they decided to check it out because they already had some recognition of who Shaq is. You might see something in new and noteworthy that stands out to you because of your particular niche. I remember going into new and noteworthy one time, looking at other podcasts in there, doing some research, and I saw that, Vimeo has a podcast. Kind of ironically, it's an audio podcast, but that's understandable. Audio is far more consumable than video, but Vimeo has a podcast. That stood out to me because I already knew about Vimeo. You might not know about Vimeo. They're a video hosting website, and so it might not stand out to you. Now, if I see Joe Schmo's podcast in new and noteworthy, I don't really care because it doesn't seem relevant to me. If I see another podcast about podcasting in iTunes new and noteworthy, then, that might be interesting to me, but I don't really browse iTunes new and noteworthy all that much. David asked in the chat, how do you find new and noteworthy on iTunes? When you launch iTunes, make sure you switch to the podcast section and go to the store. And what you'll see are multiple sections. I'll share my screen here to walk you through this because I do want you to see something. And we'll do a little test here live and discover how effective something actually is. And this will take me a moment because I am in an incognito window. And the extension that allows me to share my screen doesn't work in the incognito window until I allow it. So please stand by as I try to allow this. All right. Now, here we go. This is what iTunes looks like. This is in the podcast section, in the store. This area across the top here, this is special. If you get in here, oh yeah, that's wonderful. Now, who gets in here? People who are invited by Apple get in here. If you interview the president, if you are the president, if you are extremely famous, have a massive following, whatever, Apple picks who gets in here. Don't worry about creating artwork for this area. Apple will talk to you about that, or they'll create it for you. New and noteworthy is this section right under here. It's a list. It's two lists combined in one. It's podcasts that are new or podcasts that are noteworthy. Let's do it right here. I have not vetted this beforehand. So let's just check. Some people would call this one that says that one song. They would say that this podcast is the number one podcast in new and noteworthy. Well, you know by now, there is no number one. It's not a ranking system. So being here has no bearing on the ranking or the importance of this podcast over this podcast down here. So let's click on this first one and you'll get to see some interesting information. So this podcast has 23 reviews, 4 episodes. And the listeners also subscribe to Serial. Okay. I don't know if this is an extremely popular person. It says singer/songwriter Missy Modell. I don't know who that is. I'm not all that connected with pop culture. Let's look at number 2, see what they have. Number 2 has 8 reviews, 3 episodes. Let's look down here. TCBC from TechCrunch. They have no ratings and reviews. 4 episodes. They started in August, about a month ago. And they're in New Noteworthy. Now, they're a big company. Let's try this one, 1947. No ratings and reviews. Few episodes. The Engadget podcast, 11 ratings and reviews. They started in the beginning of August. You've seen kind of a pattern here. These podcasts don't have massive numbers of ratings and reviews. Many of them don't even have ratings and reviews. And not all of them launched with a bunch of episodes. Now, this podcast, 39 reviews. That's the highest number we've seen, but look at its position way over here. Now, these other sections in iTunes down here, these, we could call these brick features. These are specially invited by Apple as well. There's nothing you can do to appear here on your own other than make an amazing podcast and grow your audience. Same thing with the second row. The buzzed about is, well, what seems to be popular, what are a lot of people subscribing to. Apple does other certain features like the election right now. They do true crime. They'll do other things. Featured collections down here, similar thing. They make these collections. They decide what podcasts go into it. Black Voices Business podcasts, they make up these categories. The editorial staff does. There's really not much effect you get from being in this area unless you have something that does stand out and appeal to some people. You're not going to get thousands of downloads from being in here. And when you stop being in New and Noteworthy, your downloads will drop off as you then are no longer featured. And then people can decide to either stick around with your podcast or leave your podcast. Maybe you didn't keep your audience. So I'm looking at the chat room again here. I have not shared my screen on FireTalk before, so there we go. That worked fine. Good. Now I want to show you something else. Inside of, well, I'll save that for a moment. So reviews don't affect your ranking. Subscriptions affect your ranking. Search engine results are a little bit different. If you search for something in iTunes, it's a combination of the keywords that are used in certain important areas. It's a combination of total lifetime subscribers. And then there's some other things behind the scenes that we don't really see. You can, if you want to rank well, then just make amazing content and get subscribers to it. Your ranking in iTunes is not a way to get new subscribers. Your ranking in iTunes is a verification of the subscribers you have. Let me show you again the true ranking inside of iTunes. Here we are back to the iTunes homepage. Ranking is this over here, top episodes, top podcasts. We can click on this, and inside of this, and this is really cool to see, a podcast from the Cincinnati Enquirer is number 2 in all of iTunes right now. Accused podcast. I didn't even know my local major newspaper had a podcast. Well, they do, and it's number 2 in all of iTunes right now. Top podcasts category. We can filter down to specific categories like the technology category, and we can see the top podcasts here. TED Radio Hour, Reply All, some of these others. That makes sense. You can even browse down to subcategories. To do that, we go here to the categories, like technology. Then we'll scroll down to the bottom to podcasting. And then we'll look over on the side, click on top podcasts. So now this is the top podcasts in the podcasting category. And this is where I have a little pet peeve here, where some people think because I have a podcast, it belongs in the podcasting category. No, like, sorry, Felon True Crime Podcast, you're probably not talking about the art and techniques and technology of podcasting. But look, there's School of Podcasting, number 15. That's a podcast about podcasting. The Podcast Dude, number 16. The Audacity to Podcast, number 21. Now, these numbers, by the way, also don't reflect your audience size. Like, I know for a fact that some of the subscription numbers of these podcasts are not reflected in these rankings here. That's because the ranking system is more heavily weighted on your most recent subscriptions. So it's very easy for me to assume from looking at this that School of Podcasting and the Podcast Dude have had more subscriptions recently than the Audacity to Podcast has had recently. And the Audacity to Podcast, my show, has had more subscriptions recently than She Podcasts or the Podcast Method. It's more heavily weighted on the recent number of subscriptions, especially within the last 24 hours. Now, all of this cool stuff, but one of the things your reviews can do for you, and this is maybe what you've come to see, is, at least for this year, for the International Podcast Day, your reviews could help you win a gratitude award. What we did for this, and you can check out more information over at internationalpodcastday.com/gratitude, is we wanted to recognize the podcast that is changing lives for the better. And for this year, we wanted to recognize the podcast with the most engaged global audience as measured through podcast reviews using my service, mypodcastreviews.com. So what we did is we asked people to submit their own podcasts and started looking at their reviews. And this is where the top podcast may not be the one with the most subscribers. It's not purely a numbers game. What we're looking at is the most engaged global audience. And Steve and Dave, if you're around and you want to join me for this, feel free to jump in if you want, or otherwise I'm fine going solo, but you're invited to participate if you'd like to. The information from this is really interesting. Now, there were 50 finalists here. 50 podcasters submitted their podcasts. And I want to read to you all 55 of these, actually. As I'll get Steve in here. Hey, Steve.
Hey, buddy.
Jump in.
That'll be it.
Okay. Yeah, and I saw Dave there in the background. So these 55 podcasts that submitted to the International Podcast Day Gratitude Award are Amateur Traveler Podcast, the Anxiety Coaches Podcast, Arrested DevOps, The Beer 30 Show, The Blacklist Exposed, Bonus Points, BVW Wrestling Beavercast, Cinema TV, Core Brain Journal, Crowdfunding Christian Music Audio, Crowdfunding Christian Music Video. Yes, you can submit multiple podcasts into this. Dangerous Minds Podcast, Emil Carr Daily, Engaging Missions Show, Espanol Automatico Podcast, the Faith and Family Radio Show, the Fordcast, a Harrison Ford podcast, the Gabriel Series Fan Podcast, the Guillotine Grapevine, the Harry Minute. Have you seen this one? Inside Virginia Tech Wrestling, Invest Like a Boss, Manufacturing at Heart, the Marketing Book Podcast, Matt Talk Podcast Network, all shows, the Millionaire Woman Show, ODU Wrestling Monarch Mattcast, On the Mat by National Wrestling Hall of Fame, Dan Gable Museum, One-on-One with Jasper Cole, Paradigms, PlayStation Radio UK, Podcast Fiend, Podcast Reporter, Podcast Positive Phil Show, Real Estate Real World with Marquette Crespillo. Yeah. Resourceful Designer, Ringtime Pro Wrestling Podcast, Rock Your Retirements Podcast, Saha Says, She Built That, Get Inspired, Short Time Wrestling Podcast, Skip to the End, The Sewers of Paris, Social Solutions, Still Lost, Talk, Tales, and Trivia, The Traveling Image Makers, Together 24/7 with Barry and Catherine Cohen, Transcendia iRadio Show, The Way Fam, Where There's Smoke, Witness Radio, World Wrestling Resource Podcast, and Wrestling Mayhem Show. 55 finalists. And Steve, what was your thought when we started talking about this award? What was your thinking?
It's kind of a interesting story in that it was at New Media Expo 2015 that after an event, we were all hanging out, and I saw you walk by. I said, Daniel, come here. Because we were getting ready to plan for International Podcast Day of 2015. I go, I got this idea. Let me run it by you. I said, one of the things that I don't want to say bothersome, but I think one of the things that is missing in awards when it comes to podcasting is that outreach, that touching, that part of a podcast that affects your life. And I think that's very important, especially when we're talking about international things. And people that have affected people or changed a life, it could be from a marriage issue, alcoholism. I mean, we could go on and on. It could even be comedy, something that made you laugh, that made your life better. And for me, I thought that was a very important attachment to International Podcast Day. So I threw it out at you, and I think you have eyebrows. Your eyebrow went up.
One of my favorite comments on YouTube, where you eyebrows at, bro.
See? And you go, and I got a mechanism to do it. So we put our heads together and we developed the Gratitude Award. And as you know, last year was amazing with the Gratitude Award. But that was really the premise of the entire baseline of the award, that we want to be appreciative of people that are taking their time, resources, and going out and changing people's lives.
Yeah. And for this year, it was based on the engagement of the global audience and not the size of the audience. And in fact, here's some numbers from this. The top podcast from this, and we used My Podcast Reviews to do this, no entry fee for this. There were podcasts with as many as 417 reviews, but they didn't win. There were podcasts with 4 reviews, with 1 review, with no reviews. The podcast that won has a very wide audience, and it's very easy to see why. They have a global audience. And when they put the word out in an episode to say, review us, please write a review for the podcast in iTunes to tell us how you've appreciated the podcast, their audience responded. Looking at the numbers of many of these other podcasts, the number 2 podcast, what's effectively second place. There is no second place prize, but the podcast that's effectively second place might have won, but they received no new reviews. They didn't engage with their audience. I don't know if they didn't ask or if their audience just didn't do anything. Some of the podcasts with a lot more reviews don't have really a globally engaged audience. They have a primarily US-based audience. And in that US-based audience might be very big, but they didn't win. We tried to design this algorithm so that everyone was on an equal playing field here. Everyone had equal opportunity, big show, little show. And the podcast that did win, I want to read a couple reviews from, and you can hear how this podcast is affecting people's lives. Here's a review from iTunes saying, I'm so grateful to find this podcast. It is just what I have been wanting for years. I live in the Midwest of the United States and don't have my immersion opportunities. Might be getting a hint at what this podcast is. Someone else said, just what I needed. I stumbled into this podcast just when I was thinking I need to find an alternative to this other thing. They've said, formally studied this subject, but couldn't grasp it. And they said that this podcast helped them grasp the subject. Other comments are, this is the one podcast that stands above all the rest. If you really want to learn this thing, subscribe to this podcast. It's evident from the moment one in the first lesson that the host is an experienced professional who will unlock the secrets to effective learning in this subject. Presented in clear and concise terms, you will not find yourself repeating boring, ineffective exercises, but rather you will begin building your skills and confidence, thereby achieving the primary goal of learning this subject. And even just looking at the most recent reviews that this host got from when they put the word out for their podcast, recent review just from a couple days ago. This is by far my favorite podcast. I use it for learning this subject. I can't possibly express how happy I am to have found such a wonderful tool. The host does all this for free and publishes the transcripts and various other tools for free as well. They truly have a passion for helping others, and it shows clearly in their podcast. And let me read one more review here. Someone else said, over the years, at one time or another, I have subscribed to or sampled the majority of other podcasts in this niche. The good ones can be numbered on 10 fingers or less. I am now going to have to add this podcast into the mix. The host has the rare ability to perfectly communicate this subject. Her ability to layer item after item. Her thoughts seem, let me skip on to this because this is giving away who it is. So I'm going to skip that review. But the reviews in this show the impact that this podcaster is having on people. I've seen reviews that say, I was stuck and this podcast helped me out. I've seen reviews that say, wow, this has helped me more than anything else. I've seen reviews that say, I enjoy this so much, or the presenter does this perfectly. And here's something crazy. You might think, oh, this podcast probably sounds amazing, probably has a massive audience. It doesn't sound amazing. The audio is not actually that good. And the host probably knows that. But the audio quality isn't what matters. It's the content, the engaging with the audience. So the winner, with 62 podcast reviews from 15 countries, a very widespread list of all of the countries. The list of these countries are with reviews from the United States, from Sweden, from Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Finland, Brazil, the United Kingdom, Russia, Israel, France, Ukraine, and Switzerland. The winner of the 2016 International Podcast Day Gratitude Award is the Español Automático podcast with Caro Martiz. And I want to play a little portion of that for you.
Hola, bienvenidos a la segunda parte del vídeo que trata de los buenos hábitos que nos recomiendan los atletas más grandes del mundo. ¿Os acordáis bien que la semana pasada se me ha hecho el vídeo más largo de lo normal, así que decidí dividirlo en dos partes?
Now, I don't know about you, Steve, but my Spanish is so rusty. You might as well just drive a rusty nail into my head. It's that bad.
Oh, I certainly understand that.
But the engagement that she's gotten from her audience is amazing. She deserves this award. It says of her podcast, the Español Automático podcast is based on my own experiences that learning a foreign language is not difficult. I speak fluently 4 languages, and I want to help anyone who dreams about speaking Spanish to achieve it in a natural, fun, stress-free, automatic way. Learning a foreign language may be a very satisfying experience if you do it the right way. If you want to switch from learning Spanish to actually speaking it, Español Automático is your answer because life doesn't have subtitles. Español Automático helps you improve your Spanish listening and Spanish speaking skills, including the pronunciation of the title of the podcast, which I know I'm getting incorrectly. Kira Martinez shares anecdotes, real-world topics, and personal and professional development materials, creating Spanish immersion environment to help you speak Spanish fluently and effortlessly. This is the genuine Spanish you will never find in a textbook or classroom. This podcast will benefit most intermediate and advanced learners and people who need to review their Spanish. You will benefit from language learning strategies that work, Spanish idioms, and cool words frequently used in the Spanish-speaking world. And it's no wonder that she has an engaged global audience, because so many people are learning a new language, a new way of communicating. She is enabling people to reach a completely different culture, to influence lives outside of their own country. And I sometimes think, oh, it's only Americans who want to learn Spanish because we're right next to Mexico. No, her reviews from all 15 of those countries show that a lot of people want to learn Spanish and are learning Spanish from her podcast. She has a solid 4 and 5 star, almost all 5-star reviews for her podcast. So congratulations, Caro, for your winning the 2016 International Podcast Day Gratitude Award.
Amazing. Every time, we've done this a second time now, and I just get ooh, because it's so awesome that this craft is affecting people the way it does. And Daniel, I'll just end with this. That is what the Podcast Day Gratitude Award is, period, right there.
Absolutely. So if you want to check your own podcast reviews and engage with your global audience, then go to mypodcastreviews.com and check out Caro's podcast as well, and we'll certainly post the link. We'll try to get connected with her at some point to send her plaque, her free My Podcast Reviews account, as well as the free audio branding package from Music Radio Creative. And thank you, Music Radio Creative, for sponsoring that audio branding package.
Whew.
So this is the end of my hour. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for participating in this. Keep tweeting, keep podcasting, keep celebrating podcasting. I'll be back for the closing at 2 a.m. my time. And Steve, over to you. You're muted, Steve.
No, I just talk that way normally. We've got another great session coming up. Thanks, Daniel, so much for all the hard work on the Gratitude Award. I know it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of gratitude at the same time. And that's always truly appreciated. So we are going to go to break. Daniel's going to log out. We're going to log back in. And then we'll be coming up with the next session. We only got a few more hours to go. Hang with us.